If you're looking for proven ways to take your fundraising results to the next level, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast, hosted by Tammy Zonker. Tammy has trained and led thousands of nonprofit organizations to collectively raise more than $500 million, and is also recognized as one of America's top 20 fundraising experts. This is the podcast where Tammy equips and empowers amazing fundraising pros like you to transform your fundraising so you can transform the world. And now, let's hear from Tammy.
Today, I'm talking with Nathan Chappell and Cherian Koshy. Nathan's mission is to ignite generosity and transform the future of fundraising through responsible and beneficial AI. As a renowned thought leader and award-winning author, Nathan is one of the world's foremost experts on the intersection of artificial intelligence and generosity. As the head of AI for Donor Search, he leads the efforts to bring efficiency at scale through AI for many of the most innovative nonprofits in the U.S. He's also founder of the volunteer-led Fundraising.ai Collaborative, a 6,000 plus member global think tank responsible for publishing the world's first framework for responsible and beneficial AI for fundraising. Nathan's fundraising experience spans more than 2 decades, where he's led large-scale nonprofit organizations and multi-billion-dollar fundraising campaigns. He's co-author of the award-winning book, The Generosity Crisis, The Case for Radical Connection to Solve Humanity's Greatest Challenges. He's also been on the podcast previously. It's episode 42, where we dig into that book if you want to get a preview of that book and then order a copy. It's amazing. As a sought-after public speaker, a podcast guest, and editorial contributor, Nathan is regularly featured in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Advancing AFP, AHP, like the list goes on and on and on. And his podcast, Fundraising AI, is one of the top nonprofit technology podcasts globally. So Nathan brings some chops with him. Next, let me introduce Cherian Koshy, a visionary with over 25 years of social impact, leadership, and experience in transformation. His expertise blends nonprofit acumen with tech innovation, exemplified through his creation of the game-changing Nonprofit OS. With Nonprofit OS, an AI-driven platform, he has revolutionized nonprofit operations, marking a significant leap in the sector and advancing industry standard. He successfully sold Nonprofit IS in 2023 to iWave, now Kindsight, where Cherian now serves as Vice President of Product Strategy. As a CFRE, a Chartered Advisor in Philanthropy, and a Series 65 holder, he brings a unique combination of technology expertise, financial insight, and philanthropic strategy. He's on the global board of AFP and serves as vice chair of professional development. And you've probably heard him speak at many conferences around the globe, actually. He energizes, he empowers audiences with actionable data-driven strategies, and he translates complex concepts into truly accessible, impactful solutions for diverse groups interested in tech and strategy and social impact. Phew, those are some mighty big intros and bios, gentlemen.
I was going to say.
We're now done. We're now out of time for the podcast.
Yeah,
Right.
So
it was too kind, though. I appreciate the kind introduction, but honestly, we could have done, there's Nathan and then this other guy.
Yeah, no, that's not true. In fact, I think the coolest thing they shared about my bio that I was on episode 42 of your podcast, which for all the nerdy people will know why 42 is significance. And anytime I see the number 42, I'm like, oh, 42. If you don't know what that is, people can look it up.
Nice.
It's no accident, Nathan.
I think by design.
All right. So welcome, Nathan. Welcome, Cherian. And thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Having them both together, I feel like, hey, prepare to have your minds blown.
I think people expect like Rock'em Sock'em Robot with Cherian and I. Like we show up at these places and, and it's just so funny because Cherian and I were talking about this yesterday. Our industry is so unique. I remember my first nonprofit job was at a local Boys and Girls Club and had been in the private sector. And I didn't realize until a couple months later that I could actually call what was considered quote unquote a competitor and ask them for advice. And they
Mm.
were like outpouring with their generosity and their advice. And that was, reflective throughout my career and now here. And as you kind of shared in bios, Cherian and I work for two organizations, which are directly competing organizations, both serving the nonprofit sector. But I think there's just such an ethos of care and concern for the sector overall. It's really unique that we can put all that aside and come together. And what we're going to talk about today is such an incredible example and hopefully is encouraging for other people to do the same thing. And so I'm honored to be here and honored to have been able to collaborate with Cherian in this way, in like a really deep, meaningful way, not just surface level, like, oh yeah, we're like frenemies. Like it's just actually a really cool example of coming together for the common good.
I love that, Nathan and Cherian. And I think that it also exemplifies the beauty of how we can collaborate in the nonprofit sector too. Like we aren't competing,
Right.
like we joining forces to move the needle, to make differences and improve our communities is really what it's all about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, there are places where we compete, obviously, right?
Sure.
There are clients or customers or things like that where there is an element of competition. But for those of us that have been around for a while, we know that there's that place where we compete. And then there's the other place where we collaborate. And there unfortunately are, because of the size of the nonprofit sector at this point, there are folks that don't have that same level of commitment to say,
Mhm.
we're looking out for the sector as a whole. We're looking out for the people in the sector and what's best for everyone involved. And that's why I appreciate, especially the both of you, for your vision and dedication to the sector in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Cherian. So you might be wondering, how exactly did these two join forces and to what end? And so that's what we're here to talk about. They have come together personally to publish the first study specifically focused on how donors feel about the use of AI in fundraising. So it's titled Donor Perceptions of AI Implications on the Future of Charitable Giving. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And so, for context, and this is really kind of the impossible question, I would like each
We
of,
love impossible questions. Those are our
oh,
favorite
good,
kind.
So
perfect.
you,
Strymon, hold on.
you had me at hello. Had me at impossible.
So, would each of you kind of share your overarching high level point of view about the promise and perils of AI in fundraising?
That's a really long discussion. Actually, this ties into the origin story of the study. So I'll start by saying Nathan and I have known each other for quite a long time. Nathan's like the OG in the AI space. And now we're in a place where sort of everyone is an AI expert, right? Like everybody's using it, everybody's playing in it. Nathan's heard me tell this joke before, but I don't like to call myself an expert because an expert built the Titanic and an amateur built the Ark. But there's so much that's happening in the space. Nathan's been talking about it for quite some time. We're actually at a Giving Institute board meeting, and Nathan chimed in and said, listen, we're talking about these things, but what we really need to affect in terms of change is the leadership, executive leadership, and boards and how they think about fundraising. Because, and I'm slightly putting words in his mouth here, but ultimately they're looking at the easy button of AI and saying, like, oh, we can acquire donors and we can automate everything. And that's where I worry, at least personally, around the perils of AI, that it would remove humans from the interaction. We were at a fundraising AI meeting at the Bridge conference in DC, where Nathan cited the Gartner study that looked at consumer sentiment and how consumers had these concerns around AI. The point that he was making is that we could teach AI everything about human psychology, everything about what works to persuade someone to give, and it would be better than any human, uh, because it would have read everything, it would know everything about this particular subject and about this cause, and it could convince someone of the need to give and why to give, and it could gamify it, tie in all of the psychology. And is that the world that we want to live in? Is that right for us to do? And so we kind of left it at that during the meeting, and then we ran into each other on the streets of DC later that day, and we're like, this is a challenge, right? The market is, coming back to the discussion that we had earlier about how there are entities that see the nonprofit sector as a place to poach, as a place to extract resources. There's a pernicious effect of saying like, oh, the market will figure this out. But I think we have plenty of examples of where the market doesn't have the foresight to address some of these issues. And so we have all these studies about how consumers think about AI. We have all these studies about how nonprofits are ready or they're not ready. And, all those are valid. They're helpful, but nobody's ever asked donors what they think about AI. So that was sort of kind of where we started and went from there, I guess. What did I miss, Nathan, in that?
I don't know. Any podcast that uses the word pernicious, I think it's a 5-star podcast. That's why we have Cherian here to really elevate things.
Oh, boy.
If I think back, honestly, when we first started using machine learning, and our very first crappy model that we built in 2017 outperformed any model that we had done by like 5x. I knew that there was something different and that this was going to change things. And so at that point was really trying to surround myself with others that were kind of going through that same learning curve. And there wasn't that much interest because AI was very expensive and not very accessible at that point. And then when large language models came on the scene and Cherian had already been working in this space before ChatGPT came out, I think we all knew that this changed everything. Like that change was going to be exponential. And I became much less concerned at that point. So for several years, I was concerned about teaching people, don't miss the boat. If you don't focus on AI, I mean, my TEDx in 2018 was AI in the future of generosity. It was really projecting out like things are going to be different, almost trying to convince people that AI was not a fad. I became much, much less concerned with convincing people to use AI after GPT came out and much more concerned with how they use it. And I think that, is one of those things, that balance, because you asked about the promise and peril. The promise is tremendous, right? I mean, not for, selfish or shameless plug of the generosity crisis, but essentially we know the data and the headwinds that are facing the charitable giving sector. If we do things the same way, we know where things are headed. So I think we're at this truly an inflection point where AI comes on the scene that's affordable, accessible, that can provide insights and personalization at scale. And that's really, really appealing. The reality is we must learn how to support our missions in deeper and more profound ways and be able to compete against the 5,000 algorithms that we all face every day. But we also must safeguard humanity, not just in the current, but in the future. And I think that's a burden that the nonprofit sector holds that is heavy, heavy, heavy. And it's something that, private sector companies aren't necessarily concerned with. Not that they deliberately try to do harm to the future, but how for-profit entities are evaluated are based on short-term gains, how the stock market rewards them based on, what is their poor performance today. And we see this runaway technology, and investment in scale over safety and 1,000-to-1 ratio, for every dollar spent on safety, $1,000 spent on scale. And that's not their fault. It's just how capital markets work. I go back again to the heaviness of what we have to burden ourselves with. We should burden ourselves with as a nonprofit sector is ensuring that we are using this technology in a way that amplifies mission in ways that we could have never done before. I mean, nonprofit operating system is a great example of that, like totally accessible AI that nonprofits can, gain access to and really do things they couldn't before, but always doing this in a strategic and measured way where we're really balancing that promise and peril. I don't believe that we can live in a world where it's like we're trading, utility of a product over humanity. I think we in our sector have to stand above and say, we are always going to promote humanity over utility.
Mhm.
And I think that's a little bit different. And I think it's in a way exciting for us and even for you, Tammy, to have this platform to be able to help educate. Because I think the thing that concerns me the most is not people using AI, but it's using AI blindly without asking the tough questions. And if Cherian and I can be the ones to be that wet blanket we talked about yesterday, there's plenty of room in this wet blanket, like come in the fold and let's all hold ourselves to a high degree of accountability and responsibility, not for this generation, but for future, because none of us want to screw this up for future generations. There's a lot at stake. It's real. Like we don't want to envision societies that are far less generous than they are today, which could happen if we use AI irresponsibly.
Yeah.
I
Wow.
was just going to say, like, we have sort of skipped over the promise part and focused on the peril part, which is like on brand for both Nathan and
Right,
I.
right.
But I did want to just amplify it's sort of the perfect storm, right? Because in addition to the accessibility of the technology at this particular time, it comes right after the pandemic when we lost 1 million nonprofit
Mm.
jobs. We have
Mhm.
not hired all of those back. And every study indicates massive levels of burnout, massive levels of overwhelm on the part of nonprofit staff. I have been there. I have felt that. Everyone that I talk to
Mhm.
feels this way of doing more with less, and the goals keep moving up. And so there are all of these perverse incentives to press the easy button. And there are absolutely promises, right? The custom machine learning models that prioritize donors and tell you, you know, Nathan talks about precision philanthropy. That solves problems for people. It absolutely does hold promise in being able to prioritize how we focus our dollars and our time. And, Nathan's been at the forefront of that for a really long time. But if we're not asking the right questions more globally, about all the different use cases of artificial intelligence, we're going to be looking back at this. And I don't mean to make it this bad. I don't mean to say this without understanding the gravity of what I'm saying. We're going to be looking back at this in some version of climate change.
Mhm.
We're saying, oh, we didn't
Yeah.
realize that these bad things were going to happen. And now we have to sort of fix what we did. And
Yeah.
that's what
I
I think many of us are looking at least, certainly Nathan and I are looking at and saying, how do we stem some of this and make sure that we're eyes wide open as we jump into this technology?
Mhm.
I would say because we have the benefit of looking at climate change, we have the benefit of looking at social media and the
Yeah.
unintended consequences and what apathy led to. I think that's where we're really to that point, eyes wide open. We have the benefit of seeing some of those things. And I think hopefully that means this job's a little bit easier. We'll see. We'll ask us in about 2 years.
Social media is a better example. Like, I think that's the one to use. That's a good analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and honestly, what you are saying is why it was important to me to join the Fundraising AI Global Advisory Council because, and I am not an AI expert. I'm a tech forward, but I am no tech expert. But at the core of it, I believe that most of us in the nonprofit sector have a high level of moral integrity.
Hmm.
And to your point, we're trying to do more with less, and we are going to grab every tool we can to do more good in the world as efficiently as we can possibly do it. But without the deeper understanding of AI and the tools and the ramifications, we could naively do so much harm and some of
Mhm.
it
Hmm.
irrevocable harm.
Hmm.
And so I think that's why this conversation is so important and why I want to help amplify it. And I think that when we look at what you're trying to accomplish and the language, the intentional language you use around responsible and beneficial, I'm sure you spent quite a bit of time landing on those specific words.
It actually came to us over time. It was interesting because in the, early days of responsible AI, so the RAI movement, this is all still so new. It's starting to develop in ebbs and flows where, Microsoft, Amazon, Google were hiring these AI ethicists and they were creating these little teams that were focused on responsible AI. And at the core of that RAI effort is always ethics, privacy, and security, kind of the main things that kept people up at night. And, I think the part I was really torn with is that if we believe the nonprofit sector is wholly unique in the sense that we don't trade money for products or services, that we trade essentially money for trust, then by definition, how could our framework look the same as Microsoft's? And how could it look the same as Google and Amazon? I didn't know the answer to that for a year or 2. Like, it was really just it was always in the back of my mind of, like, how could it be the same? And people would say, "Well, your framework looks kinda the same." And, well, it does, but, we focus more on transparency and explainability, and we are concerned with the environmental impact of AI and all this stuff. But it was a meeting that we had. It was a fundraising AI meeting, and there was actually the answer wasn't brought up there, but we were just wrestling with that kinda esoteric part. And I ended up driving away from there And it was social media that really, really was just hounding me on this idea of that while the short term impact of social media and the promise of it was so profound to bring people together, right? Like I could have a new best friend in Kenya and we could share all these great things and stories together. And, we could connect in ways that were never before possible. But fast forward, so there was a lot of value to the short term application, but as a net benefit to humanity of social media been positive. And I think many people would argue that it has not. I mean, when we look at increases in anxiety and depression and decreases in happiness and increases in teen suicide, those are really, you know, pretty profound things that have been unintended consequence of social media. And so I think that beneficiality part of it was like, if our sector is wholly unique, then our framework, and I just use framework and substitute for our measurement of success of what AI looks like in our sector, can't look the same. And that we can't only burden ourselves with how do we use this technology to benefit organizations in the short term, that we are essentially burdened with the responsibility of ensuring that it mitigates long term harm. And I take a lot of pride in that. I feel like in the nonprofit sector, something's different. I mean, I spent 20 years raising money for organizations. And of course, I cared deeply about my organization, but I also cared almost as deeply for the sector as a whole. And I think that's unique. Like if I'm working at Samsung and I'm like, we have the best phones ever and we're, selling more cell phones, I'm not going to burden myself with Apple or, Google or anyone else who's building competing products. In one way, the analogy of how we know trees in a forest are completely supportive and interdependent of each other by the mycelium, that they can send nutrients to one another, that if something happens in the nonprofit sector where an organization's in trouble, others come to help.
Mm.
Or if someone does something really irresponsible, whether it's, we know this in like executive salaries, that if like there's a really bad article in the New York Times about executive salaries, it affects all, or there's a big scandal, it affects all. That's really unique about the nonprofit sector. And so this was something that early on I thought, well, if Twitter creates an ageist, racist, Islamophobic, ableist algorithm, which they have, and their stock price suffered the next day, it didn't affect Apple stock price or Meta stock price. It
Mhm.
affects, Twitter or X, I guess, if you will. But if, I don't know, pick any large nonprofit does that and it ends up as a headline news, it's going to have an indirect impact on many, many more nonprofits. And so, all that to say, I think I hold ourselves to a higher degree of responsibility that's not only looking at short term, but also long term. And the beneficiality part of it, I think this will continue to emerge because we're very early in all of this type of work. I think it is something that makes the nonprofit sector stand out. And with Nonprofit Alliance, they've now included the word beneficial in their work when they're lobbying at the federal level. And it's really cool to see the nonprofit sector actually take a leadership position in technology because we're usually such laggards in it. But we're not only we must actually lead in, a new path. And I hope ideally, I hope there are for-profit entities that look at that and say, yes, us too. I mean, that would be the dream come true, is that, look, the nonprofit sector really has clarity around AI in the future. Let's adopt that framework for our organizations.
Love it. Let's talk about the research and the findings itself. So, how did you approach the research? What were the data sets? Tell us.
Well, Cherian didn't sleep for 3 weeks straight. I think I don't know, yeah, how much do you drink coffee, Cherian? I
I
don't
do.
know. I don't know just what fuels you, but yeah, well, I will not try to take any of the credit for this because he is a machine and took something from idea to life very quickly. It was amazing.
Well, I appreciate that. It's actually not that difficult, and to kind of spoil the ending, we sort of both Nathan and I feel like other people can and should do this same thing because we do want this type of work to go forward. It doesn't have to be about us or anything like that. But coming back to that, running into each other on the street in DC, we were saying like nobody's asked donors. We should ask donors. How do we get this done? And so, as you mentioned, Tammy, we did this by ourselves. We didn't involve a large group of people for a lot of reasons. One is that the more people you involve, the longer it takes to get stuff done. And I said to Nathan, like, I think we should just do this. Like, let's just do it and we'll make some mistakes and we'll figure it out as we go along. But one of the benefits of kind of doing it this way is that we approached it from the perspective of how do we get to donors directly versus using an intermediary. Now, there are great studies out there, Giving Institute, AFP's Fundraising Effectiveness Project, the Google study, the Salesforce study, all of those types of things are great. They add color to the overall discussion, but there are obviously limitations of each one of them that they disclose, right? Giving Institute is looking at data from tax returns, so that excludes some individuals from being part of the study, and FEP is sourced by data that comes through CRMs. We went directly to donors through a marketing panel, which allowed us to get responses very quickly, and we were able to validate. So I think we ended up with like 1,200, 1,300 respondents, but several hundred of those we were not able to validate that they had given to a nonprofit in the last 12 months, or there are a number of flags, like they went through the survey really quickly, so we didn't think that it was a quality response and whatnot. But we ended up with just over 1,000 respondents, and then put together this study based upon 15 questions that Nathan and I went back and forth on a lot of them, and we'll get into some of the questions themselves. But it's one that, as I mentioned before, this is all open source, so the report is available. There's the data set that's available as well. So if people want to disaggregate the data and kind of run with it, they can. As a foreshadowing, if you will, once we looked at the data, we said, this is really helpful. We've got AHP coming up, the Association of Healthcare Philanthropy, and we wanted to augment the data set for healthcare donors. So one of the questions we asked is, what do you give to? And we had 300 some respondents in healthcare. We wanted to get over 500, so we added more to that, and we'll be releasing a new version that's healthcare specific around the time of AHP in November.
That's exciting. So what were some of the key findings, and particularly the findings that you found most intriguing or most unexpected?
You want to jump in there?
No, why don't you go, Cherian? I mean, I think we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, I think there were some things that our own biases as humans, and obviously our orientation about, our views on the promise and peril of AI, I thought would be more pronounced in some areas, and that took us back. But actually, some of the end conclusions I thought I hadn't really thought through this far. So it actually, I think, has helped me, and we'll get through this, but I think it's helped me really understand, okay, this is truly where we're at. And there's some really clear direction that I think the report sheds light on. So why don't you go ahead, Cherian?
So, I mean, at a high level, there's 80 pages in a row, or 79 pages or so. So it's nighttime reading if anybody's interested. But we started with familiarity and comfort around AI. And so for me, one of the big takeaways is the reports that are out there about nonprofit readiness and nonprofit familiarity with AI and use cases tends to indicate that people inside of nonprofits are not necessarily, there's lots of different studies, as Nathan mentioned, some that say nobody's using it, some that say everybody's using it. But in general, nonprofits are a little bit more hesitant just because they don't have someone like a Nathan, who's a data scientist inside of their organization, and their familiarity with those different use cases is somewhat muted. When we look at donors' responses, they are relatively familiar. They're aware of it from, I would surmise, they don't specify why they're familiar with it, but the vast majority indicated that they are familiar, probably from day-to-day use, right? Not just ChatGPT and other tools, like they know that AI helps with social media algorithms or other pieces inside of the tools that they use every day. So that led to a general comfort with AI usage for charitable activities. So we saw that there was a lot of the donors indicated their comfortability with using AI for things like solicitation of funds, donor communication, financial management. And, you could look at that data and say, well, there's a really high interest in things like impact measurement or financial fraud detection and things like that. But if you look at the overall scope, we asked them to rank 1 to 5. Everything's over a 2.5, right? So there's more comfortability than not. There's nothing at a 0 or a 1. Like, we're absolutely opposed to this. And then, as Nathan mentioned, one of the things that at least I was hoping is that donors would be more opposed to bots portraying humans, asking them for funds. I sort of wanted this visceral reaction on the part of donors that said, nope, don't do that to me. And when we asked that question, we tried to be as unbiased as possible. they were kind of middling about it. They're kind of like, it's okay. No, I think the nice thing that comes out in the study is that when we looked at concerns that donors had, they ranked privacy as a pretty significant concern. 60% indicated that they're concerned about privacy and data security, which absolutely makes sense. We should all be concerned about that. But just slightly edging it out, 60.2%, so maybe like one or two extra people, said that they were also concerned about the lack of human interaction in the fundraising process. And the very next layer, the third response, was about fundraising staff, the loss of fundraising staff. And so from my vantage point, my takeaway from that is that donors are, of course, concerned about privacy, but when it comes to things that are identity related, like cause related, that really speak to the core of who they do want to talk to a fundraiser and they care about the fundraiser as a person and their jobs. So it's easy to look at some of the kind of resulting pieces, like a third of donors are unlikely to give if organizations use AI. But what I think that belies is okay, so 9% say they're more likely to give. The largest number of donors say it's not going to matter one way or another if you use AI or not. And then another group that says I'm unsure. So if you combine the more likely to give with the it won't matter and the I'm unsure part, then I think all of that combines with donors are sort of expecting us to use AI. They're comfortable with that, but they want the human interaction. And then the last takeaway from my vantage point is around transparency and sort of declaring the AI usage inside of your organization. So like 90 some percent say you need to be transparent with the use cases, which correlates very nicely with all of the other data that they point out. And then we ask them specifically, what are the things that you want us as nonprofits to do? Number one with a bullet was, tell us on the website how you're using AI.
Yeah.
Tell us what those use cases are, what you're using our data for and whatnot. And as Nathan and I were talking about this yesterday, Furniture Bank of Toronto is a really good example if organizations are looking at ways to maybe develop a disclosure or transparency on their website. Furniture Bank of Toronto does a really, really nice job of explaining how they're using AI, why they're using AI in the ways that they are, why that's better for the cause, and involving stakeholders in that process. So, Nathan mentioned that the sort of currency of trust. What I talk about in presentations and keynotes is that when we're looking at, especially at this frontier of AI, what the data tells us is that trust is really important on the part of donors. Transparency is the path to that trust. And trust is gained in droplets. It's something that we gain over time in small amounts, but it's emptied in buckets. And it is easily destroyed when we do things without being clear with our community about why we're doing certain things or how we're doing certain things. And then to augment what Nathan said, uniquely in the nonprofit sector, trust is a bucket that can be emptied by others. So if any other nonprofit does something untoward with AI or, in general, they're not just impacting their own organization. People aren't saying, oh, I'm not going to give to fill in the blank organization. They're saying, oh, I can't trust nonprofits. I'm not going to give to organizations in general at all. And I think that's part of the issue that we're seeing in the sector. So that was a long-winded answer to your question, but there's a lot to take away, of course. And I'm curious what else Nathan has to say on that.
Well, Cherian, I mean, you covered the highlights. And again, this is open source, so people can, go through and look themselves. I think the only thing I would point out, because you covered all the important things, is that while I wanted to, and Cherian was a good balance for me on this, to say, ask a question like, how do you feel about nonprofits using deep fakes to manipulate people to give? Like that would have been a very, biased type of question. And essentially, I think the low response. So I think it was, it wasn't low, but there was concern about people in the question about using bots to ask someone for money. I also don't know that a lot of people know what that means. But if we had said nonprofits that use deep fakes to ask for money or deep fakes to manipulate someone to give, I mean, I think the answer would have been absolutely the visceral response that we expected. And so we tried to take as much of a balanced approach. But this is also why this study has to be done again and again, because as there's more familiarity with how the world is using AI, and we're moving into this, some really interesting, exciting, and also horrifying types of AI, not in the near future like now, but this next year where we move from, audio to video and in very, very convincing ways, there will be a lot more skepticism about what do I trust? What can I trust? What's real and what's not real? Because those lines will get very blurred. I mean, I think Cherian and I see this much more clearly because we're so far in that we're at the forefront of it. So we know it's a matter of months and, quarters until this type of technology hits mainstream. So it was really good. I guess for me, I could sleep really well at night, even though I didn't get the exact response I wanted on that question. I can sleep really well at night knowing that it was that 86.3% of donors saying that transparency matters. And that is such an easy takeaway. And Cherian pointing out Furniture Bank, that cost them no dollars. Like that was not something that they hired a consulting firm to do. This is a small nonprofit with just a few people and a curiosity mindset who took what was online from Fundraising AI and mashed it together with their organizational values. And within like a couple days had an AI manifesto. And they've been able to increase trust while using AI. So it's absolutely accessible to do that. And I do think if there's just one takeaway on this, is like, look, uncharted territory. We have to continue to evaluate donors' perception. And I think the biggest is like, don't make assumptions about how your organization should use AI without including end stakeholders. That was kind of an obvious thing where I think that led Cherian and I to really do this to begin with. We're like, so many companies out there using AI in all different ways, but who's asked the donors? And it kind of like was mind blowing to realize that no one had. So that's why I think the study at face value is helpful from that perspective. But then at that one takeaway of like, we must use it because your missions, I mean, deserve it and your team members deserve it. And AI can really support, amplify your mission in meaningful ways and actually reduce burnout and all those things that we've already talked about. But we need to do it in a way that protects and promotes trust. And one of those easiest takeaways is declaring how you use AI to enhance the donor experience. And I think donors in this study showed that they would reflect or they would respond to that well.
And I love and want to underscore, how could you use AI to enhance the donor experience? Not just how could we use AI to raise more money? I think even when asking the question, and over 80% of respondents reported being somewhat or very familiar with AI, that kind of question, it could mean that they thought, yeah, I've used ChatGPT.
Right.
I use Perplexity every day.
Yeah.
Some, maybe even more tech forward, understand predictive AI, but most of us don't understand the fully autonomous fundraiser, what that looks like. And to your earlier point in the conversation, that the natural influence that people have as influencers, human fundraisers are influencers, but not manipulators, right? When we cross that line to manipulation, it's a problem. It's unethical. It's irresponsible.
I mean, to that, it's an extremely fine line. I mean, we come to this conclusion as Sherry and I are working through this. AI is math, right? It's just rules based essentially. And generative is kind of weird math, but essentially, it starts with establishing a target. And a target is in fundraising, it would be to, I'll say this crudely, extract a gift from an individual, right? So asks person for money, but a bot would interpret that as extract a gift from this individual. And its ability, it has one task and it only gets rewarded if it accomplishes that one task. And that task would leverage every bit of human psychology that it ever read, which is every book ever written, every case study ever read on psychology and human behavior. And it would leverage all of the resources it has at its disposal to do that one thing. And so that really is the final conclusion is there's a fine line between asking someone for money and manipulating someone to give, and a bot will not know the difference. And so again, it's just going to take the most expedient path to accomplishing its task. And those are the impossible questions that we love to wrestle with. I think where these big philosophical questions that we must wrestle with as a sector. Like, what is the difference? It's been interesting because there's people in our sector say, well, call-a-thons or phone-a-thons in universities, haven't we turned those humans into robots by giving them call scripts and just telling them to do the same thing over and over again? And so it really calls the bigger question of like, what is manipulation? Like, what of fundraising is manipulation? When is it not manipulation? And so I don't know. I think we're wrestling with new esoteric questions that in our sector that we haven't before. And I think it gets to the heart of, are humans essential in the future of fundraising? And we should have lots of good debate about how to augment or replace. There'll be arguments on both sides. So I think for now, what we can do and rest upon is how donors, the people actually making the contributions, will react to those things. And I think that needs to serve as a guiding light and a path forward. Because again, just because we can do something from a technological perspective, it doesn't mean we should. And I think the biggest takeaway is like we as a sector really need to be thoughtful about how we're building things, and because they're cool and they're interesting and they're neat and they're
We are
efficient
cool.
and all right, and they're really good at their job. These things are like amazing, and not doing that in a silo without continually pinging the people that have forever since the beginning of mankind, the ones that are enabling nonprofits to do their thing. And that would be the donors that come alongside and partner.
Yeah, I love it. And honestly, that is the brilliance of this report, like inviting the all important donor into the conversation.
Right.
And I suspect in doing so, strengthens trust.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I just want to highlight too, right, that Nathan and I are kind of wet blankets in some ways, but we're not obviously Luddites. We're not,
Right.
we both work in companies that are at the forefront of AI delivery for nonprofits. So we do think that there is benefit individually and for the sector, but also the study reflects donors' perceptions around the benefits of AI as well. So if you're a fundraiser listening to this podcast, there are places where we need to very much ask very good questions and think about the future. And there are kind of pieces where we're never going to go back to typewriters, right? We're never going to go back to technologies or tools that don't serve us well. There are ways in which AI can do that, and donors see that. So one of the
Mhm.
questions that we asked literally to donors is, do you think that it has the ability to improve nonprofit effectiveness? And 49% said, yes, we do think it
Right.
does. So if you're looking at a board or executive leadership that says, no, we shouldn't adopt any form of AI and we need to just do everything on paper or something like that, the donors are saying they see the effectiveness potential of AI. Now, of course, someone's going to say, oh, but that means 51% said it's not. And that's not the case, right? There's 24% that said, no, not really. 8% that said definitely not, but 20%, that said they were unsure of
Right.
how it could be used. And that may be just lack of familiarity or comfort or just not knowing how nonprofit operations function. So the largest number of donors is saying, we think there's benefit here for you to be more effective with the cause. So it's certainly something that organizations should responsibly investigate as part of their continued innovation and growth and
Yeah. I
process.
mean, imagine if we asked donors, like, would you donate to an organization that decided not to use the internet? I mean, we know the internet's capable of doing lots of bad things and spreading misinformation. And that would seem absurd. You're like, absolutely, no, I'm not donating to an organization that doesn't use the internet because how inefficient would they be? Like, what are they doing? I couldn't even fathom what that even would look like. That will happen with AI eventually, right? I mean, AI will be so ubiquitous at everything that we do. But I think in this middle area and going back to, yeah, I mean, Cherian and I are at the forefront of like the nerdy cool stuff. Like we're always, I mean, this weekend it was like literally text messages back and forth over a new platform that came out, and we're just mind blown of the power of this. And it doesn't have to be a trade-off. It's like, oh, it has scary capabilities of how people could misuse this. Don't use it at all versus like always with any technology, look at the cool aspects of it and how it can support you, but never forget to evaluate unintended consequences. So
Mhm.
always, look for new and innovative ways to more efficiently support your mission. And I would argue that you must in this day and age be able to leverage technology to support your organization. But there's always just a but to do it in a strategic and measured way that mitigates long-term and unintended consequences. And that's not an either or. That is, you must do both. And I think donors in this study really responded to that. I mean, they saw the value of organizations using AI for operational efficiency, for privacy and security and things like that. They absolutely recognize that value. And people look, I mean, also like personalization that comes from AI. Like we like to go on Amazon and not have it just recommend toenail clippers every time I go on because I'm a human and I have toenails. We like the convenience of Netflix kind of at least trying to, you know, share titles that we might be interested in watching versus just the gazillions of things that we probably won't want to watch. So we're used to that and becoming more familiar as humans of the convenience of algorithms directing our path a bit. And nonprofits should be square in the middle of that as well.
So good. This technology is rapidly evolving. How do folks keep up? What are some resources you would recommend they tap into to join in the conversation and continue learning and contributing and being curious?
Well, I'll be totally biased in one aspect. I think Cherry and I probably never compared notes. I think we're just continual learners, like lifelong learners. So reading books and, following certain people. So for me, definitely I have a cadre of different people that I follow, including like Ali K. Miller and Cassie Kozikoff and Connor Grennan and others that are, just help me give me a little shortcut to like, I can't watch everything. So there's a few people that I trust are going to be at the forefront, but also do that in, I think, I can consider it a balanced way, if you will, not just because it's cool, you should. And then we try to distill that down on the Fundraising AI podcast. So we try to break it down and we just interviewed Cherian yesterday on there, but to bring people on, but also, track where Sam Altman's working any given week. And so, and why that might matter or not matter to nonprofits. So I would just encourage everyone to number one, to be curious. I think that's probably the most important inherently human thing that we could do now. Be curious and then find a few things, whether it's a blog or a person, and spend a little bit of time a week learning on this because to your point, Tammy, it's evolving so quickly. This is considered an exponential technology, which humans have never encountered before. And not just the fear of missing out, but the fear of falling behind is real. Like, I mean, this happens not in a sequential way of like step one, step two, step three. It's like step 1, 2, 3, 24. And when Cherian and I, in fact, the text messages that led to this Saturday morning, where we got to a 1, 2, 3, 24 moment, and we're like, "Are you paying attention to it? Did you see this? Like, holy moly!" And it's very easy to fall behind if you're not following a few people that are talking about this stuff. Cherian, I'm
Yeah.
sure you have a whole bunch of people that you follow as well.
I do. I mean, there's a lot of overlap, of course. Like Ethan Malik is one
Yeah.
that I also follow, but there's some really smart folks that are talking about this. So I was going to say, like, follow Nathan on LinkedIn. The partnership on AI also has
Hmm.
some really good stuff. A friend of mine is over there, and so I've been following them for a long time. But they have some really good ideas around
Hmm.
kind of what this means and from a responsible and ethical perspective. I would say that the one thing I want to be wary of is most nonprofits don't need to be an expert in artificial intelligence. Most
Hmm.
fundraisers don't need to be at the bleeding edge of what's happening in AI. So they need to have like a fundamental understanding of what the ramifications of the technology is so that they're aware of when a use case happens, right? Like, how does this speech to text or text to speech function? What are the benefits of this? What are the drawbacks of this? What could this mean in the future? So rather than trying to understand like how, a K factor works in large language models, which I don't think you need to do. I also, this is not a popular opinion, but I also don't think that you need to be a prompt engineer in a
Right.
nonprofit, right? I know there are people that disagree with me, and that's fine. I honestly think that there's a core understanding of good fundraising practice that you need to be focused on. And that's where I would recommend that you make sure that that is solid, and then see how the technology aids and abets that work. What are the things that the technology can do that enables you to do the work that you love to do, if it's relationships with donors, or even if it's like playing in Excel spreadsheets, right? Like, what does that enable you to do at this point, which is consistent with where we've been in the sector? Just know that the technology is going to rapidly change, and how you do your work will change more significantly
Mhm.
over the next year than it has over the last 5.
Yeah.
That's the thing that, and this is true individually
Mhm.
as well as institutionally. So it's going to make a huge difference in terms of how you adapt to change personally and professionally. And whether you want to be an AI expert or play with the shiny new object, that's totally up to you. But I don't want you to feel overwhelmed and like, I have to go learn a whole new thing, because that's not really the case. By the time the technology is vetted and has a use case that you would be, comfortable with, and you're approved by your organization and all of that, you'll figure it out. I don't doubt that. But there are
Yeah.
simple things that you can do today. I mean, I remember this was earlier in the year, right? Tammy, you had the Transform Summit, and I had a Tammy Zonker in a hybrid color t-shirt, right? Like, there are things that you can do that are really easy and
Mhm.
fun to do, that are just, if you want to play, go play, but don't feel like this is part of your job description now. We're got to go like get a certificate or something.
There's so much wisdom in what you just shared, Cherian, and I feel that tension that is growing within the nonprofit community of like, I feel like I'm missing out. I don't know what's going on. And this is actually is interesting. I still remember Cassie Kozikoff did this at Google years ago, where she said, look, all of you know how to use a microwave. But, you don't need to know how to build a microwave. You need to know
Right.
how to use it, and you need to know how to evaluate the effect when it's working. So we know if our food is hot and it's not burned or it's not cold, that it's working well. And so, I mean, it takes a lot of pressure off to say, look, there's these tools that do this thing, use them and understand when they're working well. So everything you just said, Cherian, it should be just put into a blog on how to navigate change in a exponential time.
I'll have AI do that later.
I know, no doubt. Yeah, I'll be done in about 5 minutes.
Right.
So it's very obvious why these two gentlemen are my go-to expert. I mean, I follow some others, I read others, but these two, to me, are the people that I follow because of everything you've learned today and more. Thank you both. It's been amazing to talk with you. Thanks for sharing your expertise and your insights on this really, really important topic.
Well,
Yours.
thank you, Tammy, and for bringing us on this platform. This is one of the most fun podcasts I've had in a long time. And don't tell my co-host of Fundraising AI, but this is a blast, and really appreciate you bringing us on and allowing us to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, Tammy, you're too kind to really appreciate your leadership in the sector and your podcast. And it's absolutely a go-to, and all of the resources that you provide. So thanks
Yeah.
for having us on.
Yeah, my pleasure. If you want to learn more about Nathan and Cherian, fundraising.ai, the fundraising.ai virtual summit and the recordings from the summit that happened on October 1st, or the framework toward responsible and beneficial AI for fundraising, or maybe you just want to download your very own copy of the report, Donor Perceptions of AI Implications on the Future of Charitable Giving, check out the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intentional Fundraiser podcast. Keep on transforming your fundraising so you can transform the world. The Intentional Fundraiser podcast is a Fundraising Transformed original. It's hosted by me, Tammy Zonker, founder and president of Fundraising Transformed, where we help equip and empower fundraisers, nonprofit leaders, and board members to transform their fundraising so they can transform the world. Visit fundraisingtransform.com/podcast to subscribe to this podcast, and subscribe to my newsletter to get fundraising lessons, tools, and helpful resources delivered straight to your inbox each month. If you want my help with taking your fundraising to the next level, become a member of my Fundraising Transformers community as a growth member and join me live each month where I'll teach you the same strategies I use to lead, train, and coach thousands of nonprofits, social service organizations, healthcare foundations, private schools, colleges, and universities to collectively raise more than $500 million, including a single gift of $27.1 million. As a member, you can participate in my Ask Me Anything sessions every month and get answers to your burning questions. Chat with other growth members inside our private and safe online community about what you're working on, struggling with, and share lessons learned. And get instant access to my growing library of on-demand self-paced training classes. New content is added every single month. Learn more about becoming a member at fundraisingtransform.com/growth. Talk soon.